Welcome back. Tonight, we're leaving the familiar streets of Tokyo behind and traveling to the southern tip of Africa to South Africa, a land where ancient traditions run deeper than gold mines and where certain objects carry more power than most people realize. You see, when travelers visit South Africa, they're often drawn to its incredible markets. From the bustling streets of Johannesburg to the colorful stalls in Cape Town, you'll find everything from beautiful beadwork to intricately carved masks, traditional healing herbs, and spiritual artifacts that have been crafted using methods passed down through centuries. Most tourists don't realize they're looking at more than just souvenirs. In South African culture, many objects are imbued with spiritual significance through traditional healing practices. Items like Muti traditional medicine, made from plants, animal parts, and minerals, are not just herbal remedies. They're believed to hold spiritual power that can influence everything from luck and love to protection and prosperity. But here's what no travel guide will tell you. Some items are never meant to leave their homeland. In South African tradition, certain objects are connected to ancestral spirits, and disturbing that connection can have consequences that follow you across oceans. The Zulu, Xhosa, and other Bantu peoples believe that ancestors actively guide and protect the living. Traditional healers, called sangomas, serve as mediators between the world of the living and the spirit realm. When you take something that's been blessed, cursed, or simply belongs in a specific spiritual ecosystem, you're not just taking a souvenir, you're potentially disrupting forces you don't understand. Tonight, I want to share 4 stories from people who learn this lesson the hard way. These aren't urban legends or folklore passed down through generations. These are documented experiences from people who thought they were bringing home harmless mementos, only to discover that some gifts from South Africa come with strings attached, strings that stretch all the way back to the ancestors. The first lesson you need to understand about South African spiritual tradition is this: respect and ritual are everything. Traditional healers believe that ancestors must be shown proper respect through ceremony, and when that respect is violated, the ancestors will make their displeasure known. So before we dive into these stories, ask yourself, when you travel, do you consider the spiritual weight of what you're bringing home? Because sometimes, the most beautiful souvenirs carry the heaviest burdens. Let's begin with a story that happened just 3 years ago, involving a German tourist, a traditional healer's shop in the Eastern Cape, and a small leather pouch that should never have left South Africa. Klaus was the kind of tourist who prided himself on authentic experiences, not for him the sanitized safari tours or luxury wine estates. When he visited South Africa in 2021, he wanted to see the real country, which is how he ended up in a tiny village in the Eastern Cape, far from the tourist trail. He'd heard about traditional healers from his Airbnb host in Port Elizabeth. If you want to understand South African culture, she told him, you need to visit a sangoma, but be respectful, this isn't a tourist attraction. Klaus found himself outside a modest rondavel on the outskirts of the village. The air was thick with the scent of burning impefo, traditional healing herbs. When he knocked, an elderly woman emerged, wearing traditional beaded clothing and carrying herself with the quiet dignity of someone who commanded respect. "I am Mama Nomsa," she said in careful English. "You are the German the spirits told me was coming." Klaus felt a chill. He hadn't told anyone in the village he was German. Mama Nomsa led him into her healing hut, where animal skins hung from wooden beams and shelves lined the walls, filled with bottles containing mysterious substances, traditional muti made from plants, animal parts, and minerals. The space felt alive, almost breathing with spiritual energy. "You come seeking knowledge," she said, settling cross-legged on a woven mat. "But knowledge without wisdom is dangerous, especially for someone who doesn't understand the ancestors." Klaus watched, fascinated, as she performed a divination ritual, throwing animal bones and shells onto a cowhide mat. The way they landed, she explained, allowed her to communicate with ancestral spirits who guided her healing work. "The bones say you have pain in your chest," she said suddenly. "Not physical pain, heart pain. Someone you loved is gone." Klaus's breath caught. His father had died just 6 months earlier, something he hadn't mentioned to anyone. "The ancestors see your grief," Mama Nomsa continued. "They want to help, but..." She studied the bones more carefully, her expression darkening. "There is danger if you try to take their medicine to foreign lands. The ancestors do not travel well when they are not invited." But Klaus was already mesmerized. He pulled out his wallet. "Can you make something for me? Something to help with the grief?" Mama Nomsa hesitated. Muti is not like Western medicine. It works because of the relationship between the healer, the ancestors, and the patient. when that relationship is broken. She shook her head. But you are in pain. I will make something, but you must promise me use it here. Before you leave South Africa, do not take it home. She disappeared into a back room and returned with a small leather pouch sewn shut with sinew. Inside, Klaus could feel what seemed like dried herbs and small bones shifting around. This is for healing a broken heart, she said. But listen carefully, you must burn a small pinch each night at sunset while facing east toward the ancestors. You must do this for 7 nights here in South Africa. On the 7th night, you must bury what remains. Do you understand? Klaus nodded, but his mind was already racing. This was exactly the kind of authentic experience he'd been seeking. He paid Mama Nomsa generously and promised to follow her instructions. But Klaus was a collector. His Hamburg apartment was filled with artifacts from his travels, Tibetan prayer bowls, Peruvian worry dolls, Turkish evil eye charms. In his mind, the Muti pouch would make a perfect addition to his collection. That first night at his guest house, Klaus followed the ritual. He burned a pinch of the herbs at sunset, facing east as instructed. The smoke had an unusual smell, earthy and animal-like, with something else underneath that he couldn't identify. As it rose, he felt a strange sense of peace, as if invisible hands were lifting the weight from his chest. It worked so well that he decided he needed to take it home. Surely, he reasoned, if it worked here, it would work in Germany too. Mama Nomsa was just being superstitious about keeping it in South Africa. On his last night, instead of burning the remaining herbs and burying the pouch as instructed, Klaus packed it carefully in his suitcase. The flight back to Hamburg was turbulent, but Klaus attributed that to normal weather patterns. It wasn't until he was home that things started to go wrong. The first sign was the dreams. Every night, Klaus dreamed of the Eastern Cape, but not the peaceful village he'd visited. In his dreams, the landscape was twisted and dark, filled with angry voices speaking in languages he didn't understand. He'd wake up exhausted, feeling like he hadn't slept at all. Then came the cold spots. Klaus's apartment, which had always been warm and comfortable, developed areas where the temperature would drop suddenly. The cold wasn't just physical, it felt hostile, like an unwelcome presence pushing against him. But the worst part was the growing sense of being watched. Every time Klaus was alone, he felt eyes on him. Not human eyes, something older, something that didn't belong in his modern Hamburg apartment. 3 weeks after returning home, Klaus decided to try using the Muti again. Maybe it would help with the nightmares. He lit a small portion at sunset, facing east as Mama Nomsa had instructed. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The smoke didn't rise gently as it had in South Africa. Instead, it swirled violently, forming shapes that looked almost like faces. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Klaus heard what sounded like drums beating in the distance. Then the voices started. Not in German, not in English, but in what Klaus later learned was Xhosa. They were angry voices, demanding to know why he had stolen what belonged to the ancestors, why he had broken the sacred relationship between healer and patient. Klaus ran from the room, but the voices followed him. For 3 days and nights, they haunted his apartment. His neighbors complained about the drumming sounds coming from his flat, though Klaus's drums were silent. His houseplants withered and died overnight. His cat, normally friendly and social, hid under the bed and refused to come out. Finally, desperate and exhausted, Klaus called Mama Nomsa. It took him hours to track down her number, but when he finally reached her, she wasn't surprised to hear from him. "You took the Muti home," she said simply. "I told you not to." "I'm sorry," Klaus stammered. "How did you know?" "Because the ancestors told me you would. They also told me you would call when you were ready to listen." There was no anger in her voice, just sadness. "You have brought beings into your world that don't belong there. They are angry and confused, and they will not rest until they are returned home." The solution, Mama Nomsa explained, was not simple. Klaus would need to send the Muti back to South Africa, along with offerings to appease the ancestral spirits he had disturbed. But more than that, he would need to understand that some things are sacred not because of superstition, but because they represent relationships between the living and the dead that span generations. Klaus shipped the leather pouch back to Mama Nomsa's village, along with money for the cleansing rituals she would perform. Only then did the voices stop, the cold spots disappear, and his dreams return to normal. But the experience changed him. Klaus still travels, still collects artifacts from around the world, but now he asks permission first, learns about the spiritual significance of objects before he purchases them, and respects when he's told that something is not meant to leave its homeland. Because he learned what every traveler should know, some souvenirs carry more than memories. They carry the weight of generations, the power of ancestors, and the consequences of crossing lines that should never be crossed. The Muti taught Klaus one final lesson. Traditional healing is not about the herbs or objects themselves, but about the relationship between healer, patient, and ancestral spirits. When that relationship is broken, the medicine becomes something else entirely, something that can follow you home. Sarah Martinez thought she understood art. As a curator for a contemporary art museum in Los Angeles, she traveled the world, worked with pieces from every continent, and prided herself on her ability to appreciate cultural artifacts within their proper context. So when she found herself in a traditional craft market in Johannesburg in early 2022, she was confident she could navigate the cultural significance of what she was seeing. She wasn't one of those tourists who bought sacred objects without understanding their meaning. She did her research. The mask that caught her attention was unlike anything she'd seen in museum collections. Carved from dark wood and adorned with white clay patterns, it had an almost magnetic presence. The seller, an elderly man named Joseph, explained that it was a traditional ancestral mask from the Xhosa people, used in ceremonies to communicate with the spirits of the dead. This mask, Joseph told her in perfect English, was carved by my grandfather's grandfather. It has been in ceremonies for over 100 years. It has seen many spirits, many ancestors come and go. Sarah was fascinated. She knew that in many African cultures, masks serve as vessels through which ancestral spirits can interact with the living world. When worn during ceremonies, they allow the ancestors to speak through the wearer, providing guidance and protection to the community. "Are you sure it's appropriate for me to buy this?" she asked. "I don't want to take something that's sacred to your family." Joseph studied her for a long moment. "You respect the mask, yes? You understand it is not decoration?" Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "I work in a museum. I understand cultural significance. This would be displayed with full context and respect." What Sarah didn't mention was that she planned to keep the mask in her private collection, not the museum. Something about it called to her personally, beyond her professional interest. Joseph seemed satisfied. "The mask chooses its keeper," he said. "If it came to you, there is a reason. But remember, this mask has housed ancestral spirits for generations. They do not easily forget where they belong." Sarah paid for the mask and carefully packed it for the journey home. During the long flight to Los Angeles, she kept thinking about Joseph's words. The mask chooses its keeper. What did that mean exactly? Back in her Santa Monica apartment, Sarah found the perfect spot for the mask on a shelf in her living room, positioned where natural light would highlight the intricate carving work. She researched its origins thoroughly, learning about Xhosa initiation rituals where masks embody ancestral spirits and guide youth into adulthood. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. Sarah enjoyed having the mask as part of her collection, and she'd often catch herself looking at it while working from home. There was something compelling about its expression, the way the carved features seemed to shift depending on the light and angle. The first sign that something was different came during a dinner party Sarah hosted for colleagues from the museum. As they sat in the living room discussing a new exhibition, one of her guests, a specialist in African art, suddenly stopped mid-sentence while looking at the mask. "Where did you get that?" Dr. Williams asked, his voice oddly strained. "Johannesburg," Sarah replied. "From a traditional craftsman." "Why?" Dr. Williams got up and moved closer to the mask. "Sarah, this isn't a reproduction or contemporary piece. This is authentic, genuinely ancient. The wear patterns, the style of carving. This mask has been used in actual ceremonies." He looked uncomfortable. "Do you know what that means?" Sarah felt a flutter of unease. "That it has cultural value? That it has spiritual resonance," Dr. Williams said quietly. In traditional African belief, masks like this become inhabited by ancestral spirits over time. When they're used in ceremonies repeatedly, the spirits begin to see the mask as a home. The dinner party continued, but Sarah found herself distracted, glancing frequently at the mask. For the first time, she noticed something unsettling in certain light. The carved eyes seemed to follow movement around the room. That night, Sarah had the first dream. She found herself in a rural landscape under an endless sky, surrounded by people in traditional Xhosa dress. They were singing and dancing around a fire, and many wore masks similar to the one now sitting in her living room. But in the dream, the people were angry. They pointed at Sarah and spoke in Xhosa, their voices growing louder and more agitated. Though she couldn't understand the words, the meaning was clear. She had taken something that didn't belong to her. Sarah woke up feeling unsettled but chalked it up to Dr. Williams's comments affecting her subconscious. However, the dreams continued every night, growing more vivid and disturbing. In the dreams, she was always the outsider, the one who had taken what she shouldn't have. The ancestors spoke to her in increasingly urgent tones, and Sarah began to sense their frustration at not being understood. By day, strange things started happening in her apartment. The mask seemed to move on its own, not dramatically, but Sarah would swear it faced a different direction than where she'd left it. Her African art books would be found open to pages about ancestral worship and spirit possession. The temperature around the mask's shelf was consistently several degrees cooler than the rest of the room. 3 weeks after bringing the mask home, Sarah was working late one evening when she heard singing. It was faint at first, like music drifting from another apartment, but as she listened more carefully, she realized the sound was coming from her own living room. She found the mask exactly where she'd left it, but the singing continued traditional African harmonies that seemed to emanate from the carved wood itself. Sarah stood frozen, listening to voices that shouldn't exist, coming from an object that shouldn't be able to produce sound. The singing stopped abruptly when she approached, but that's when Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. The wooden surface of the mask was warm to the touch, and when she looked closely at the carved eyes, she could swear she saw movement behind them, not the wood itself, but something looking out from within. Unable to sleep, Sarah spent the night researching online, learning about African spiritual beliefs regarding masks and ancestral possession. She read about how masks used in repeated ceremonies become permanent homes for spirits, and how disturbing these spiritual dwellings can have serious consequences. The next morning, Sarah called the craft market in Johannesburg, desperately trying to reach Joseph. When she finally got through, his reaction to her call was not surprise, but resignation. "The ancestors came to you in dreams," he said. "It wasn't a question. How did you know?" "Because they came to me too," Joseph replied. "They are unhappy. They are far from home, in a place where they are not understood, cannot fulfill their purpose. The mask was meant to stay here, with people who know how to honor what lives inside it." Sarah felt a wave of guilt and fear. "What do I do?" Joseph was quiet for a long moment. "The mask chose to go with you, but the spirits inside did not choose to leave Africa. There is a difference. You must return what you have taken, but first, you must ask forgiveness." Following Joseph's guidance, Sarah performed a simple ritual that night. She burned impefo, traditional healing herbs, and spoke to the mask, acknowledging her ignorance and asking the ancestral spirits for forgiveness. She promised to return them home where they belonged. The response was immediate. The temperature in the room rose, the oppressive feeling that had been building for weeks lifted, and for the first time in a month, Sarah felt at peace in her own home. Shipping the mask back to South Africa was expensive, but Sarah didn't hesitate. She also sent money for Joseph to perform proper cleansing ceremonies and to make offerings to the ancestors she had unknowingly displaced. Joseph sent her photos of the ritual he performed when the mask returned. Community elders gathered around a fire, the mask placed in a position of honor. Traditional songs being sung to welcome the ancestral spirits home. "The ancestors forgive," Joseph wrote in his accompanying letter. "They understand you acted from ignorance, not malice, but they want all travelers to know. Some beautiful things are beautiful because they are home. When you take them away, you take away what makes them beautiful." Sarah still works as a museum curator, but her experience with the ancestral mask changed her approach to cultural artifacts. She now works closely with indigenous communities to ensure that sacred objects are displayed with proper context and permission, and she's become an advocate for returning artifacts that were taken without understanding. More importantly, she learned that respect isn't just about appreciating beauty or historical significance, it's about understanding that some objects are not meant to be owned, only honored. The mask taught Sarah a lesson that every traveler should remember. When you take something that serves as a bridge between the living and the dead, you're not just taking an object, you're disrupting relationships that span generations, and those relationships have a way of demanding to be restored. Marcus Webb was what you might call a spiritual tourist, the kind of guy who collected crystals from every country he visited, wore Buddhist prayer beads despite not being Buddhist, and had sage bundles from 3 different continents in his London apartment. He believed in energy and vibes, but more as lifestyle accessories than actual spiritual principles. So when Marcus found himself in a traditional medicine market in Durban in 2020, just before the world shut down, he was like a kid in a candy store. The Faraday Market was everything he'd hoped for. Rows of traditional healing shops featuring animal skins hanging from ceilings, bottles filled with mysterious substances, and vendors selling everything from love potions to protective charms. Marcus went from stall to stall, buying anything that caught his eye. A piece of crocodile skin for protection, dried vulture brain for prophecy, various herbs and roots that vendors claimed would bring luck and prosperity. He was particularly drawn to small carved figurines and traditional jewelry, items that looked authentically African and would make impressive conversation pieces back home. At one stall run by an elderly Zulu woman named Mashezi, Marcus found what he thought was the perfect centerpiece for his collection, a small wooden figurine about the size of a child's doll, covered in animal hair and decorated with beads and shells. It had an unsettling quality, large wild-looking eyes and exaggerated features that seemed almost grotesque. "What is this?" Marcus asked, picking up the figurine. Mashezi looked uncomfortable. "That is not for sale to tourists," she said, trying to take it from his hands. But Marcus was already enchanted. "It's incredible craftsmanship. How much?" "You do not understand," Mashezi insisted. "That is Tokoloshe. It is not decoration. It is, how you say, spiritual being. Very dangerous for someone who does not know how to control." Marcus had never heard of a Tokoloshe, but Mashezi's reluctance only made him want it more. He pressed her with questions. What did it do? Where did it come from? Why was it dangerous? Mashezi eventually explained that the Tokoloshe was a mischievous and evil spirit from Nguni mythology, a dwarf-like creature that could become invisible and was called upon by people with magical abilities to cause trouble for their enemies. "So, it's like a voodoo doll?" Marcus asked, completely missing the cultural significance. No, Mashezi said, growing more agitated. "Tokoloshe is living spirit. It attacks people in their sleep, causes nightmares, illness, even death. Only Sangoma should have such things, and only to protect against other Tokoloshe." But Marcus heard only what he wanted to hear. An authentic African spiritual artifact that would be the crown jewel of his collection. He offered her triple the price of any other item in her stall. Mashezi refused repeatedly, but Marcus was persistent. Finally, worn down by his offers and arguments, she agreed to sell it, but only after making him promise to treat it with respect and warning him multiple times about the dangers. "You must put salt around your bed," she told him urgently. "You must raise your bed high off ground. Tokoloshe cannot reach you if you are high up. And you must never make it angry. If you do not respect Tokoloshe, it will not respect you." Marcus nodded and made all the right promises, but internally he was rolling his eyes. He was a modern, educated man. He didn't really believe the figurine had any supernatural powers. It was simply a beautiful, culturally significant artifact that would look amazing on his mantelpiece. The flight back to London was uneventful, but Marcus noticed he felt unusually tired despite having slept well the night before. He attributed it to travel fatigue and the stress of navigating international flights during the early pandemic period. Back in his Kensington apartment, Marcus placed the Tokoloshe figurine in a place of honor on his living room shelf, surrounded by his other spiritual collectibles. He took several photos to post on social media, proudly showing off his authentic South African spirit guide to his followers. That first night, Marcus had trouble sleeping. He kept feeling like he was being watched, but every time he looked around his bedroom, nothing was there. When he finally drifted off, he had vivid, disturbing dreams of a small, hairy creature running through his apartment, knocking things over and laughing in a voice that sounded like broken glass. He woke up exhausted and found several items in his living room had fallen over during the night, books, picture frames, even a heavy ceramic vase. Marcus assumed it was vibrations from construction work in the building next door, but the disturbances continued night after night, getting progressively worse. Marcus would wake up to find his refrigerator door open, electronics turned on that he was certain he'd left off, and increasingly, a sense of malevolent presence in his apartment. The dreams became more specific and terrifying. In them, Marcus was visited by a creature exactly like the figurine he'd bought, short, covered in hair, with wild eyes and long fingers. But in the dreams, it wasn't a carved wooden figure. It was alive, mobile, and very, very angry. The dream Tokoloshe would speak to Marcus in a mixture of English and what sounded like Zulu, telling him he had taken what didn't belong to him, that he had brought a spiritual being into a place where it didn't want to be. 3 weeks into this nightmare, Marcus was at his breaking point. He'd barely slept, his work was suffering, and he was beginning to question his own sanity. The physical disturbances in his apartment had escalated to the point where neighbors were complaining about noise, though Marcus swore he wasn't making any. That's when he remembered Marchese's warnings about raising his bed and putting salt around it. Desperate for sleep, Marcus decided to try her suggestions, despite feeling foolish about following superstitions. He moved his bed frame onto cinder blocks, raising it about 3 feet off the floor, and sprinkled salt in a circle around it. That night, for the first time in weeks, Marcus slept peacefully. But his relief was short-lived. While the Tokoloshe seemed unable to reach him in his raised bed, it took out its frustration on the rest of his apartment. Marcus would wake up to find his kitchen destroyed, cabinets opened, food scattered everywhere, dishes smashed. His living room would be in chaos, with furniture overturned and his other spiritual collectibles broken or missing. The breaking point came when Marcus woke up one morning to find deep scratches carved into his wooden coffee table, spelling out words in what he later learned was Zulu, "Send me home." Terrified and out of options, Marcus managed to track down Marchese's contact information through the Durban market. When he called her, her first words were, "The Tokoloshe is making trouble, yes?" "How did you know?" Marcus stammered. "Because I have not slept well since you took it," Marchese replied. "Tokoloshe is not happy in cold, foreign place. It wants to come home to Africa, where it understands the spiritual landscape. In England, it is lost and angry, like wild animal in cage." Marchese explained that the Tokoloshe was not just a figurine, but a vessel for an actual spiritual entity. In South African tradition, Tokoloshes are called upon by witches or traditional healers for specific purposes, but they must be managed with great care and respect. When taken from their cultural context, they become unpredictable and dangerous. "You must send it home," Marchese told him. "But first, you must apologize. You must acknowledge that you took something you did not understand and ask for forgiveness." Following her instructions, Marcus performed a simple ritual that night. He placed offerings of food and drink near the figurine, burned sage, the only purifying herb he had, and spoke directly to the Tokoloshe, apologizing for his ignorance and promising to return it to South Africa. The response was immediate. The oppressive feeling in his apartment lifted, the temperature returned to normal, and that night, Marcus had his first dream in weeks that wasn't a nightmare. In it, the Tokoloshe spoke to him more gently, explaining that it wasn't evil by nature, it was simply a spiritual being that belonged in a specific place, with specific people who understood how to work with it. Marcus shipped the figurine back to Marchese with money for any cleansing rituals that might be necessary. She sent him a photo a few weeks later, showing the Tokoloshe figurine in its proper place in her traditional healing practice, surrounded by other spiritual tools and artifacts. "Tokoloshe is home and happy," she wrote. "It forgives your mistake, but it wants other travelers to know spiritual beings are not souvenirs. They are not decorations. They are living forces that belong in the places where they are understood and respected." Marcus's experience fundamentally changed his approach to spiritual collecting. He still travels, still appreciates different cultural traditions, but now he asks permission before taking spiritual artifacts, learns about their significance before purchasing them, and most importantly, respects when he's told that something is not meant for tourists. The Tokoloshe taught Marcus what every spiritual tourist needs to learn. Authentic spiritual power is not a commodity to be collected. It's a living force that belongs within specific cultural contexts, and when you remove it from those contexts, you're not just taking an object, you're displacing a spiritual being that may not appreciate the relocation. Some souvenirs are meant to stay home, and some spiritual beings will go to great lengths to make sure they get there. Priya Patel thought she understood the significance of what she was buying. As an anthropology graduate student researching African textile traditions, she wasn't just another tourist picking up random souvenirs. When she spent 6 months in South Africa in 2019 working on her thesis, she made a point of learning about the cultural meaning behind every artifact she encountered. That's what made her experience so unsettling. Priya had done her homework. She knew that in Zulu and Xhosa traditions, beadwork isn't just decorative, it's a complex communication system where colors, patterns, and arrangements convey specific messages about identity, relationships, and spiritual connections. She understood that certain pieces were created for specific ceremonies and carried deep cultural significance. So when she found herself in the rural KwaZulu-Natal province, staying with a traditional Zulu family as part of her research, Priya was confident she could navigate the cultural protocols appropriately. The family matriarch, Gogo Nomsa, was a master beadworker whose creations were sought after throughout the region. Her work went beyond mere craftsmanship. She was known for creating pieces that served as spiritual protection and connection to ancestral forces. Priya spent weeks learning from Gogo Nomsa, understanding the meaning behind different color combinations and patterns. She learned that white beads represented spiritual purity and ancestral connection, red symbolized life force and passion, black offered protection against negative energies, and specific arrangements could call upon ancestral guidance or ward off evil spirits. Each piece I make, Gogo Nomsa explained as she worked on an intricate necklace, is not just jewelry. It is prayer, protection, communication with those who came before us. The ancestors speak through the beads to those who know how to listen. Near the end of her stay, Gogo Nomsa presented Priya with a gift, a stunning traditional necklace made of black, white, and red beads arranged in patterns that seemed to shift and change depending on how the light hit them. The centerpiece was a small carved bone pendant that felt warm to the touch. "This is for you," the elderly woman said, placing it around Priya's neck. "The ancestors told me in a dream that you would need protection on your journey home. But listen carefully, this necklace is not ordinary beadwork. It carries the blessing of many grandmothers, many generations of women who watched over their families. It will protect you, but it also means you are connected to us now, part of our spiritual family." Priya was deeply moved by the gift and the honor it represented. She understood that she was being entrusted with something sacred, and she promised to wear it with respect and understanding. "Remember," Gogo Nomsa added, her expression becoming serious, "ancestral spirits are not like Western ghosts. They are not dead, they are transformed. They continue to guide and protect their descendants. When you wear this necklace, you are carrying their presence with you. Treat it accordingly." Priya wore the necklace for the remainder of her stay in South Africa, and indeed, it seemed to bring her luck and protection. She avoided getting sick despite being exposed to various illnesses, navigated potentially dangerous situations safely, and felt a sense of spiritual peace she had never experienced before. But it wasn't until she returned to a graduate program in Toronto that she began to understand the full implications of what she was carrying. The first sign came during her thesis defense presentation. As Priya discussed her research on South African textile traditions, she began to feel dizzy and disoriented. The room seemed to shift and blur around her, and for a moment she could swear she heard voices speaking in Zulu, not audibly, but as if they were speaking directly into her mind. The voices were women's voices, and they seemed to be commenting on her presentation, offering corrections and additional information about the cultural practices she was describing. Priya found herself incorporating details into her presentation that she didn't consciously remember learning, speaking with an authority and depth of knowledge that surprised even her. Her thesis committee was impressed, but Priya was disturbed. Where had that additional information come from? That night, Priya had the first dream. She found herself back in KwaZulu-Natal, but not the modern province she had visited. This was the landscape as it existed generations ago, filled with traditional homesteads and people dressed in historical Zulu attire. In the dream, she was surrounded by women, grandmothers, great-grandmothers, ancestors stretching back through generations. They spoke to her in Zulu, but somehow she understood every word. "You carry our stories now," they told her. "You wear our protection, so you are bound to our lineage. We will guide you, teach you, but you must honor the connection." Priya woke up feeling both exhilarated and terrified. The dream had felt more real than her waking life, and the sensation of being surrounded by ancestral spirits remained with her throughout the day. As weeks passed, the dreams continued and intensified. Priya found herself learning things about Zulu history and culture that weren't in any textbook. The ancestral spirits, for that's what she had come to understand them as, would teach her traditional songs, share stories about historical events from perspectives that had never been recorded, and offer insights into spiritual practices that were usually kept within families. Her academic work benefited enormously. Priya's research became more nuanced and authentic, incorporating perspectives that impressed her professors and peers. But the personal cost was significant. She felt increasingly disconnected from her own life and culture, drawn more and more into the spiritual world of the Zulu ancestors who spoke to her through the necklace. The turning point came during a family dinner when Priya's Indian grandmother noticed the necklace and asked about it. "That's a very powerful piece," her grandmother said, studying the beadwork carefully. "I can feel the spiritual energy from here. Where did you get it?" When Priya explained, her grandmother's expression grew concerned. "Beta, do you understand what you're carrying? That's not just jewelry, it's a spiritual inheritance. You've been adopted into their ancestral line, but you're not prepared for what that means." Her grandmother, who had her own deep understanding of spiritual traditions, explained that ancestral connections were not casual relationships. When ancestors choose to guide someone, it creates responsibilities and obligations. They expect honor, respect, regular communication. If you can't fulfill these obligations, the connection can become problematic. That night, as if responding to her grandmother's warning, the ancestral dreams became more demanding. The spiritual grandmothers, who had been gently teaching Priya, now seemed frustrated with her failure to understand her obligations. They spoke of rituals she should be performing, offerings she should be making, traditions she should be maintaining. But Priya was in Toronto, not KwaZulu-Natal. She didn't have access to the proper materials for traditional rituals, didn't fully understand the spiritual protocols, and was increasingly overwhelmed by the pressure of obligations she wasn't equipped to fulfill. The ancestors' frustration manifested in Priya's waking life as well. She began experiencing what felt like spiritual pressure, a constant sense of being watched and judged. Her academic work, while still excellent, began to feel like it wasn't her own. She was channeling knowledge and perspectives that belonged to other people, other generations, other cultures. Worst of all, Priya began to feel like she was losing herself. The constant presence of ancestral voices made it difficult to access her own thoughts and feelings. She felt like a vessel for other people's wisdom rather than an individual with her own identity and perspective. Finally, recognizing that she was in over her head, Priya called Gogo Nomsa in South Africa. "Ah, child," the elderly woman said when she heard Priya's situation. "I wondered when this call would come. The ancestors have been visiting me in dreams, telling me you are struggling with the connection." "I don't know what to do," Priya admitted. "I'm grateful for their guidance, but I feel like I'm losing myself." Gogo Nomsa was quiet for a long moment. "The ancestors chose you because they saw something special in you, but you are not Zulu. You were not raised with the traditions that teach how to maintain these relationships properly. This is my fault. I gave you a gift that was too powerful for someone without the proper cultural foundation." The solution, Gogo Nomsa explained, was not to sever the connection entirely. That would be disrespectful to the ancestors and potentially dangerous. Instead, Priya needed to transform the relationship from one of spiritual inheritance to one of respectful collaboration. Following Gogo Nomsa's guidance, Priya performed a ritual acknowledging her deep gratitude to the ancestors while explaining her limitations as someone from a different cultural background. She asked them to continue blessing her work, but to allow her to maintain her own identity and spiritual autonomy. The response was immediate and positive. That night, Priya dreamed again of the ancestral grandmothers, but this time they seemed more understanding and less demanding. They explained that they had been testing her, ensuring she would respect the spiritual connection rather than taking it for granted. "We will continue to guide your work," they told her, "but we understand you are not our descendant. You are our friend, our bridge to sharing our stories with the world. This is also sacred work, but different work." From that night forward, Priya's relationship with the necklace and its spiritual energy changed. The ancestral voices still came to her, but as collaborators rather than spiritual authorities. Her academic work continued to be enriched by their perspectives, but she retained her own voice and identity. Priya still wears the necklace, and her research on South African textile traditions has become some of the most respected work in her field. But she learned a crucial lesson about spiritual gifts and cultural borrowing. Traditional African beadwork, like many indigenous spiritual practices, is not just art or decoration, it's a living system of communication between generations, between the living and the ancestors. When you accept such gifts, you're not just receiving an object, you're entering into relationships that span generations and carry obligations you may not understand. Priya's experience taught her that respect for other cultures means not just appreciating their beauty or wisdom, but understanding the responsibilities that come with spiritual gifts. Some treasures from South Africa don't just follow you home, they invite you into families, lineages, and spiritual relationships that transform not just what you know, but who you are. The ancestors taught Priya that the most powerful souvenirs from South Africa are not objects at all. But relationships, and like all meaningful relationships, they require respect, understanding, and the wisdom to know when you're in over your head. These 4 stories share a common thread. Each person thought they understood what they were taking home from South Africa, but none truly grasped the spiritual weight of their choices. Klaus wanted authentic medicine, but didn't respect the relationship between healer and ancestors. Sarah appreciated cultural significance, but didn't understand that some beauty belongs only in its homeland. Marcus collected spiritual artifacts without considering that spirits might not appreciate being collected. Priya honored traditions, but wasn't prepared for the obligations that come with ancestral gifts. The lesson these travelers learned is one that every visitor to South Africa should understand. Traditional objects are not just crafts or curiosities. They are part of living spiritual systems where ancestors actively guide the living, where healing depends on proper relationships between spirits and healers, where respect and ritual maintain the balance between seen and unseen worlds. Before you pack that beautiful mask, traditional medicine, or ancestral beadwork in your suitcase, ask yourself, am I taking something that wants to come home with me, or am I forcing something to leave where it belongs? Because sometimes the most beautiful souvenirs from South Africa are the ones you leave behind, and the memories, respect, and understanding you carry forward instead. Remember, not everything that calls to you is meant to come home with you. And some gifts from the ancestors are more than gifts. They're invitations into relationships that will change your life in ways you never expected. Travel with respect. Learn with humility. And always remember that in South Africa, the spiritual world is not a tourist attraction. It's a living reality that demands acknowledgement, understanding, and reverence. Some things are meant to stay where the ancestors can keep them company.